Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for coming to this talk at very short notice. My name's David Skelton. I'm Deputy Director of Policy Exchange, and we're really thrilled to have Gary Pisano speaking this afternoon on rethinking industrial policy, which, as it happens, is something we're really interested in at Policy Exchange as well. We're really interested in the importance of manufacturing to a rebalanced economy and to British competitiveness. And as importantly, what is the role of government in making this happen? What does a modern industrial policy look like? We think are moving beyond the picking winners and rescuing lame ducks of the 1970s. And we're thinking more about what government can do to create the right kind of environment for manufacturing and the role that manufacturing can play in a competitive economy in the future. Gary has very kindly agreed to do this at very short notice, and that's greatly appreciated. He's professor of business administration at Harvard Business School. His very widely acclaimed Restoring American Competitiveness article in the Harvard Business Review was really important to people looking at this over the past few years. And the book, I believe, is coming out later this year, Producing Prosperity: Why America Needs a Manufacturing Renaissance. And I think we can also say the same for the UK. So very interested to hear what Gary has to say.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for coming. And you all came on short notice too, and I appreciate it. When I turned and walked in the room and I saw a large group of people, I was extremely impressed and extremely delighted. So thank you all for coming. I'd like to try to keep this very interactive. I've got a set of slides to share with you, maybe 15-20 minutes of my talking, giving you an overview of some of the issues, and then really open it up for discussion and questions. I think that's probably the most productive way to do this. A little bit of background. These are issues I've been thinking about for quite some time. It actually goes back to 1981, and in fact, my interest in these issues started in the UK. When I was still a student, undergraduate, I spent a year down at Sussex at the Science Policy Research Unit. I think many of you know that group, where I began to gain an interest in understanding how countries' capacity for innovation affected their trade performance and their growth. And in some sense, these were important issues then. They were hot issues then. They kind of went away. What happened, at least in the US, what happened is by about the 90s, the kind of idea of the Japanese threat had subsided. Japan was struggling. Still is struggling. We were having a big boom, and everybody kind of said, well, so much for competitiveness issues. It was outdated, kind of out of fashion. But I don't think these issues have ever really gone away, and I've continued to think about them through my work. I've spent the last 24 years on the faculty at Harvard Business School, where I've taught managing innovation and manufacturing strategy. So for me, it's always been a kind of natural to think about manufacturing as being tightly linked to innovation. And my work has really covered a broad range of industries. So I look at these issues through many lenses. I used to say that I did work in technology-intensive industries, but I don't know what that means anymore, because every industry I come across now, there's just a lot of technology. I've recently been doing some stuff in the apparel industry, and I thought that was the last vestiges of kind of traditional, industry. And I'm just amazed by the kind of technology. I mean, they employ, PhDs in material science to help them figure out things you can do with fabric. So I think the idea of high tech and low tech is sort of going away a bit. I will talk a lot about, from my experience, obviously, I understand the US situation far better. But my sense is there are very strong parallels to the issues and the kind of things that I'll talk about between the US and the UK. And there's some differences. There's some important differences. But certainly, both countries have very strong service sectors. Both have witnessed relative declines in their manufacturing. That is, manufacturing as a part of their overall size of the economy, number of people employed. Both are facing shorter-term growth employment issues, which are important issues. But really, I think this topic is more one around again, and a lot of common discussion in the US and the UK on longer term structural issues in the economy. And that's, I think here you talk about it as rebalancing, and this issue has come up in the US. This is the shameless self-promotion part. This is the book that was mentioned. So a lot of this that I'll talk about, we go into a lot more detail. But in addition to the shameless self-promotion, I also listed here because I do want to give full credit to my co-author, Willy Shih, who's been my collaborator and co-conspirator in this research project. So the things I'll talk about today are really shared ideas that Willy and I have developed over the last several years. So I start this talk, as we start the book actually, this is the first sentence of the book, and I start all my talks this way. This is just basic data from the US, but I think I did a little preliminary work before coming over to the UK, and I think this data would look remarkably the same for the United Kingdom. And basically, if you look at the US in 1950, about 1 in 3 Americans were employed in manufacturing, and about 27% of our GDP was in manufacturing. And by 2010, it's about 1 in 10 workers, and roughly a little more than 1 in 10 of the GDP is manufacturing. And I think the number for the UK for manufacturing is about 10 or 11%, something like that for the workforce. It's within a % difference, and given the noise you get in these kind of GDP figures, they're, for all intents and purposes, the same. And I believe roughly the same trajectory. So the first question is, who cares? I mean, should we worry about this, right? Should we worry at all about that manufacturing is a smaller part of the economy? Should we worry about it in the US? Should you worry about it in the UK? Does it matter? There's the debate, at least as it's taking shape in the US, but I think it's taking shape like this through Europe as well and in the UK. So there's one side of this that says, look, don't worry about this at all. This is just a healthy transition to a post-industrial economy. This is no different than what happened to agriculture in the past century. If you looked at agriculture in the 1800s, I'm sure it was a very significant part of the UK economy. It became a much smaller part of the UK economy. You moved into industrial sectors, and you grew wealthier as a result. So this is just the next step, and it's good news. And a number of people have said that the notion that manufacturing is something that deserves special attention is some combination of dangerous and distorting. Jagdish Bhagwati at Columbia University, very respected economist, very thoughtful guy, talks about this as a kind of the latest flirtation with manufacturing. He called it a fetish at one point. I'm not sure it's in that. There it is right there. The fetish is particularly rampant in the US. Lots of people share this view. My colleague at Harvard Business School, Michael Porter, has talked about this obsession with manufacturing is distorting the debate. We have to get past that. Services are where the real value added lie. Manufacturing is low value added and basically best left to other countries to do. And he's a very smart, thoughtful guy. So that's one side of the debate. The other side of the debate looks something like this, that manufacturing is a source of good-paying blue-collar jobs. Manufacturing is somehow different, that if you lose it, you don't have a foundation to build your economy on. And among many others, this is the view taken by the current president of the United States, President Barack Obama, who in a speech at a Rolls-Royce plant in Virginia says America thrives when we build stuff better than the rest of the world. He makes a very strong, kind of unapologetic manufacturing matters argument. Two very different ways to look at the world. And so, our work on this has really been to say, what's happening here? Can we gain some headway on this debate? And the way we look at it is as follows. In the last 40 years, the US, and I think the UK and many other countries in Western Europe have been running what we call a big experiment. They've been running an experiment in post-industrialization. So they've been betting on the hypotheses that the view that manufacturing does not matter, that this is a healthy transition, they've been betting on the view that that's correct. And what I've tried to set out to do in my work is just to sort of, let's evaluate that experiment. We're kind of a few decades into it. It's probably got another couple of decades to run. By the time it runs its course, it's going to be too late to change things around. So if we discover in 2 decades from now that this was really a big mistake to let manufacturing, wither to a small part of the economy, if we discover that in a decade or two, it's going to be too late. So let's look at it now and sort of take stock. And that's what we've set out to do in the work. And so here's our argument in a nutshell. So the first thing that we argue is that, so there's often this story of the advocates of manufacturing that say, look, you can't really create real value without manufacturing. And that argument that's a very naive argument. There's a massive amount of value created in services. So the notion of something physically tangible and something that's not tangible having any difference in value holds no ground. There's nothing in economic theory that suggests that's true. There's nothing empirically. Most of us are willing to pay good money for services just as much as we're willing to pay our good money for physical products. So that's one, we kind of, that is not part of our thinking on it. We kind of think, people who advocate that's the wrong argument for manufacturing. The second argument that's often put forward is about jobs. You need manufacturing to generate, it's a good job generator. And that one doesn't hold up either. If you look at the data, in fact, just go back to the data I presented a short time ago. 1 in 10 American jobs are in manufacturing. I think it's about the same, 1 in 10 in the UK. With any kind of increase in productivity, if you just do the math, it's really hard to imagine enough increase in output of manufacturing for manufacturing to ever become a big generator of job growth. In fact, it's highly unlikely that the percentage of people employed in manufacturing in the US will go up if productivity improves, which we want it to improve. That's a good thing. So manufacturing, the argument for manufacturing is not one based on generating jobs. There's a kind of second argument related to that, which is a bit correct, but a bit incorrect, which is it's a source of jobs for people, blue-collar jobs, less well-educated, somebody who went to high school. They used to be able to get a good, high-paying job, reasonably well-paying job as a blue-collar worker working in a factory in the auto industry, et cetera. So there's an argument that says without manufacturing, we have no place for those people. So the historical fact is true, but my view is, and we'll talk about this more later, that given the changes in manufacturing, those people have a problem. Those people are not suited for manufacturing jobs anyway. That is, manufacturing jobs, at least in advanced industrialized countries, are becoming high-skilled jobs. So the problem of somebody who does not have a lot of education, is not well-trained, they have a big problem on their hand. That is, they have a problem because there's going to be fewer jobs for those people in any sector in advanced industrialized countries. So we can't make the argument of we need to save manufacturing to save all these people who don't have skills. The solution to that problem is make sure people have skills. Manufacturing is not going to solve that problem. Our argument is that manufacturing matters when it's integral to the innovation process. That is, we need to start seeing places where manufacturing and innovation are really part and parcel of the same story. And so that means in some places manufacturing matters a lot, and in some places it matters less so. And again, my view is for the US economy, the UK economy, and I think most of Western Europe, future prosperity is going to be based on countries' ability to continue to be very innovative. If you just look at the data on the size and expansion of the workforce around the world, since 1990, the global workforce has increased by 1.4 billion people with the entry of Brazil, Russia, India, and China into the world economy. There is no way a country like the UK or the US can maintain reasonable wages unless it continues to be highly innovative. So the story about manufacturing has to be tied to manufacturing. We think there's three kind of myths that we try to resolve about manufacturing. And this is where the manufacturing does not matter crowd gets it wrong, because they take a caricatured, almost cartoonish view of what happens in manufacturing. The first myth is that advanced industrialized countries should focus on knowledge work, not manufacturing. Okay. The reality is, a lot of what goes on in manufacturing is very knowledge intensive. I spend a lot of my time going to manufacturing plants in the US and in Europe, and my co-author Willy Shih, the same thing, all around the world we've gone into plants. What you see happening in a lot of manufacturing plants today, regardless actually of the industry, whether it's a high-tech or low-tech industry, is knowledge work. There's a lot more brain than brawn required in a modern manufacturing plant today. So this notion of the knowledge economy, although vaguely defined, I'm all for, but that does not exclude manufacturing. In fact, it very much includes a lot of manufacturing. The second myth is that advanced industrialized countries should focus on innovation, let others do the manufacturing. Okay, and sometimes we'll hear this term, designed in America, made elsewhere. And there's people who say that's absolutely fine. We want to do the R&D, let the Chinese do the manufacturing, let the Malaysians do the manufacturing. We don't need to do the manufacturing, we'll do all the R&D. What that fails to ignore, the reality is that often, not always, but often, developing and scaling up manufacturing processes is as integral to the innovation process as the design of the product. And there's an awful lot of innovation that occurs in manufacturing. The best example of that is the industry I've probably spent most of my career studying is biotechnology. And biotechnology has been a story of process innovation in manufacturing, as much as it's been about drug discovery. And that's often ignored. The third myth is that advanced industrialized countries should focus on industries of the future and don't worry about mature industries because that's how you kind of move on to the new stuff. And so if you have industrial policies, focus on the new stuff, don't worry about the old stuff. The reality is a little more complicated. First of all, industries demature. So there's nothing, as humans, we're stuck with a biological life cycle. We're born young, we go through teenage years, we hit our peak, we get old, and it's one-way street. That's dictated by biology and laws of biology. There's no similar laws for industries. The consumer electronics industry used to be a highly mature business. In the 1960s, consumer electronics was so mature that just about all the American consumer electronics companies decided to move their manufacturing out of the US because it was just a matter of producing at the lowest cost possible. I think anyone today with an iPad or an iPhone or an Android phone, etc., would highly doubt to call consumer electronics a technologically mature business. It's actually been where the most exciting stuff has been going on. And video games as a consumer electronics product. There's a lot of technology there. So industries can demature. The other issue is mature sectors are often places where new technologies get brewed and they wind up in other sectors. So if you ask the question, why is it today that just about every electric vehicle in the world, the lithium-ion batteries, are made in Korea or somewhere else in Asia? And the cells, which is really the tough part, are almost all made there. They're sometimes assembled outside. They're sometimes assembled in the US. Why is it that batteries why do the Asians dominate, and the Koreans in particular, dominate batteries? Well, that story goes back to consumer electronics. In the 60s, when American companies outsourced their manufacturing, eventually the design and R&D went to Asia as well, because it was valuable to have the R&D close to the manufacturing. And American companies didn't care because, after all, consumer electronics was mature, and nobody seemed to mind. In fact, lots of people saw the decline of the consumer electronics industry in the US as a very healthy sign because we were making way for other things. Now, if you think about sectors that have had an incentive to push the development of small, highly efficient batteries, not the auto sector, right? That 12-volt battery in your car today that you use to start your car, that's the same battery design that's was in your father's car and in your grandfather's car and maybe your great-grandfather's car. The locus of innovation for batteries became the consumer electronics industry because we all wanted devices which were smaller, smarter, lighter, more compact. And batteries became a huge constraint on the functionality of our cell phones and our laptop computers and now our tablet computers. So the locus of innovation shifted to consumer electronics. The locus of innovation in batteries shifted to consumer electronics, and that was in Asia. And that's why today the battery R&D and manufacturing is located. So it's a great lesson about the myth of a mature sector. Maybe it's not so mature as we'd expect. We asked two focal questions in this book, and we can have some discussions around these. When does it matter if a particular sector, like semiconductors, migrates offshore? Should you worry if you don't have a semiconductor industry? And secondly, when does it matter if a particular manufacturing capability moves offshore? Right? So let's say you continue to design semiconductors in your country, but the manufacturing is done in, say, Taiwan. Should you worry? Is that a problem or not? There's a couple of ways we've tried to get at this problem. Because these all have to do with the linkages between sectors. So how does it matter what happens here? Does it affect some other part of the economy? And we have this notion of what we call the industrial commons, which says the following. If you look at an industry, so we measure industries. Government statistics measure industries very narrowly, right? And say, well, there's automobiles and you know, there's mobile telephones and, right? And that's a necessity to measure it that way, because that's how you can measure the output. But if you look beneath the surface of any industry, there's a whole constellation of capabilities. So a car is not just a car. A car is kind of the amalgamation of metal processing technology, precision machining, advanced materials, electronics, software, et cetera, et cetera. And often those underlying capabilities for a given, that feed an industry, feed multiple sectors. So take, again, a good example is precision machining. You'll find precision machining used in traditional products like cars. You need it for, say, machining the engine blocks. But you also find it for medical devices, and you find it used in aerospace, and in a whole range of other sectors. And so it's a common resource, if you will, for a lot of sectors. And that's why we have this notion of like, you know, the old days, the commons is where everybody's sheep and cows grazed. It was a shared resource. You see the same thing for industries. There's underlying capabilities that are in the suppliers, that are in customers, that are embedded in institutions like universities, that are embedded heavily in the workforce, that become a shared resource. And what the commons argument says is be careful, because if you gain an erosion in one part of in one industry that feeds the commons, if that commons evaporates, you lose future options for innovation. So a good example of that would be what has happened in semiconductors in the US, semiconductor processing technology. So the US is still a very innovative place with semiconductor design, but the only company that continues to manufacture semiconductors in the US largely is Intel. Most of the manufacturing now, if last year or the year before, there were about, say, 20 semiconductor plants built around the world, 23. One was built in the United States. I think one was built in Western Europe, and the rest were built in Taiwan, Korea, and China. Now, semiconductor processing technology, though, is used to, the same technology and the same equipment suppliers support solar photovoltaic cells. Those are basically semiconductor processes. So, you know, when in the US we ask why is it we have trouble having a competitive solar PV industry, well, if you're going to open up a new solar PV plant, you got to open it where there's suppliers. Where are the suppliers? They're in Asia. Where are the production engineers who can help you solve the scale-up problems? They're in Asia. So that's where you're going. Where's the rest of the supply chain? It's in Asia. So that's where you're going. Advanced displays. Most advanced displays use essentially it's a semiconductor processing technology. It uses the same kind of equipment, the same production engineering techniques, a lot of the same workforce skills are needed. So despite the fact that a lot of the basic science for advanced displays was invented in the US, in US universities, none of the manufacturing occurs in the US. It occurs in Asia. So the danger, it shows how when a comment shifts, it can be a great pull for future innovation. This is one of the things we have to be concerned about. This is just a picture of a story just told around flat panel displays, and I knew it would be too small on the screen. The second interesting issue is, when must R&D and manufacturing be closely related to each other? So does it matter if we just do the design of semiconductors in the US and the manufacturing elsewhere? If you do the design of automobiles in one place and the manufacturing occurs elsewhere, do they have to be together? And what we'd argue is it depends on the nature of the technology. And this really gets to the heart of the argument of where manufacturing matters. We say there's two dimensions that matter. One is the degree to which the product and process technology are tightly integrated with each other, or modular. So modular means they're easily separable. That is, I don't need information about the manufacturing process to do the design and vice versa. That's a highly modular technology. If I think about when I write a book, I'm engaged in a design process. I'm designing, I'm writing. There's a whole production process, say how the book gets printed. I don't care how the book gets printed. It has no impact on what I write and how I'm going to write it. It's completely, once I hit the send key, when I send the manuscript to my editor, as far as I know, it's gone. Okay? I'm perfectly capable of writing a bad book without the production process to blame. That is not true in a lot of businesses, in a lot of sectors, right? Where intimate knowledge of the production process is required to do the design and vice versa. Biotechnology, a great example of that. So that clearly starts to matter in terms of where the link between R&D and manufacturing. The second is the degree of process maturity. Is this a process technology that is very immature, has a lot of future development to go, or in essence has the process technology hit its mature state? If you kind of do it, and oversimplifying a bit, you get a classic kind of business school 2x2. You can see in one corner of the quadrant. Let's see if I highlight. There we go. This is the kind of quadrant where it's really manufacturing, the co-location of R&D and manufacturing just doesn't really matter. And in fact, we would expect these to be sectors where advanced industrialized countries would have a hard time competing in the manufacturing, because the R&D can be done one place and the manufacturing, you can shop it anywhere else in the world. So desktop computers, a lot of consumer electronics are like that today, active pharmaceutical ingredients, and lower-end commodity semiconductors are like that. And there, I would argue, manufacturing just doesn't matter to a country's capacity to innovate. At the other extreme, though, are what I call process-driven innovation, where not only is the product and process technology tightly integral, intimate knowledge of one is needed to develop the other, but the process technology itself is highly immature and rapidly evolving. So in essence, evolution of the process technology will drive opportunities to innovate in the product. If you're not capable of the process innovation, not capable of the manufacturing, you will not be capable of the product innovation. And I would see that in things like biotech, nanomaterials, certain areas in displays, advanced displays, and super miniaturized assembly. Okay? And then there's some off-diagonal ones, which I'm not going to go into. They matter here, but for different reasons. And I think our argument, so our argument at the end of the day, from both a policy point of view as well as for managers, is we have to frame the debate in terms of what kind of technologies are we talking about, and where is this intimate connection between R&D and manufacturing necessary. Final two slides, then we open up. Whoop, I just did the, there we go. I somehow managed to, Cody, you want to just put it back on display mode? Yeah, that's all I need. Oh no. Don't worry, I'm not going to make you sit through the whole thing again. I got to advertise my book again, though, so maybe I was doing that intentionally. We'll go down to the last two slides here. There we go. So management. I know we're going to talk a lot about policy, but first off, from a management point of view, I think a lot of these are I think companies, particularly in the U.S., now I can only really speak to the U.S. case, The way they've been doing their sourcing, they've been doing the math wrong. They've been getting the calculus wrong because they haven't looked at the value of co-location as seriously between R&D and manufacturing. So I see many companies outsourcing things when it's just not in their own interests. So I don't make the argument that American companies should be manufacturing in America to be patriots. I argue they should do it under many circumstances because it's actually the best thing long term that they should do. Or by the way, if you're an American company and your R&D is in the UK, then the right thing for you to do if you're in one of these co-location boxes is do your manufacturing in the UK. So I don't see it as a kind of the national origin of the company doesn't matter. I think companies have been getting the calculus wrong. I think they've been blaming, in the US, they kind of blame Wall Street, forcing them into short-term behavior. I think that's just become an excuse. That's the devil made me do it excuse. I think it's just poor management. From a policy point of view, the debate in the US, at least, and I think to some extent in the UK, although I'm less familiar with it here, has kind of bifurcated into the two ideological extremes. At one level, a group of people say, it's all free market, the government has should not be involved with this at all. The government will just screw it up. And, in the US say this is what made America great, lots of free markets. And then the other extreme of people who advocate very heavy-handed industrial policy, saying in a world where you have countries like China subsidizing industries, we have to subsidize industries and we have to fight back. And they distrust markets. So one distrusts governments, the other distrusts markets. At least in the case of the US, that debate is completely useless. And it is completely inconsistent with the history of the US, where despite it being quite a free market-oriented economy, we've always had a very healthy mix of government policy and government support for innovation, going back to at least the 1860s in lots of different ways. So I think we need to think about, what I would encourage on a policy basis is thinking about manufacturing as part of the broader innovation policy portfolio. And I think the most effective role of government is in picking the problems and catalyzing the experiments of alternative approaches to tackle that problem. In the US, DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, I think has done is kind of the role model for how this can be done, where they have not tried to pick specific commercial technologies. They've done a marvelous job identifying new scientific trends, amplifying them through research, creating a lot of parallel approaches, but then basically letting the market and the private sector sort out how you use these, how you commercialize it, what's the business model, what works, what doesn't. And I think the role of government is to fertilize the ground, get the building blocks in place, but then let the market take over where it's best taking over once you start to think about commercial applications. I do not think the role of government is to pick the winners of saying, here's the right industry to subsidize, or even worse, the right the right firm. We've tried that in the US. It's never worked in the US. We just tried it recently with Evergreen Solar, a set of solar and alternative energy companies who got subsidies, most of whom either went bankrupt or moved their production to China. It didn't work. It's just too hard for governments to pick this stuff. It's too hard for the private sector does it, and that's why we have multiple experiments, and some people make money and some people don't, but we run a lot of experiments. And I think the final piece here is really getting the building blocks. So the investments in kind of basic and applied research that's related to manufacturing and building the right kind of human capital. It does take a very skilled workforce to be doing advanced manufacturing. Let me stop there and open it up.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I think that was really fascinating. I'm sure everyone really was invigorated by that. We've got about 45 minutes for questions, so plenty of time for questions to Gary. I'm sure that's a lot of food for thought and plenty of potential questions. We've already got one at the back of the room.
Sorry? Should I sit down? Yeah, it's probably more comfortable to sit down too.
Chris Francis, IBM. Thank you very much. Fascinating talk. I wanted to actually ask your opinion on the GDP figures from the 1950s and how they compare to today. Because one of the factors I've always considered to be in there is the disaggregation of the business model itself. The factory in the 1950 probably was actually a business in its own right. It had everybody from the cleaners through to the consulting engineers, designers, marketers, and product salespeople who are now all working in separate companies and in the service figures.
Yeah, fair enough. And so they're listed. So some of this is the accounting problem, a national accounting, right? So that if I was a cleaning person and I worked in the factory, I was counted as a manufacturing worker before, and now I work for a cleaning company, which is a service company. So there's a chunk of that is there. But there has been, if you look at, the data is on the backup, I wasn't going to go into it. If you look at, say, investments in manufacturing, capital expenditures for manufacturing plants, so one of the statistics, industrial structures, which are basically factories. If you look at investment in those, they've also gone down. So that parallel, so some of it, you're absolutely right, is a statistical artifact. So some of it is, should we worry? Well, there's not even as much to think about worrying. But there has been real decline as well if you start to look at the actual activity by the,
Interesting, the MP for Newcastle put a hand up a few minutes ago. That Newcastle was founded around manufacturing, so I'm curious to your views.
That's absolutely right. I'm Chian Moore. I'm the MP for Newcastle, which was at the forefront of the first industrial revolution. I'm also the Shadow Minister for Innovation and Science, and so I was particularly pleased to hear such a strong advocacy for the relationship between innovation and manufacturing, which certainly isn't something that we hear very often, and I like the way that it's very evidence-based as well. The only thing I would say was that you didn't put any emphasis on the importance of diversity in the economy as one of the reasons to encourage manufacturing as well. I would also agree with a lot of what you say in terms of the support for innovation from policymakers. I think it's interesting that DARPA is often held up as an example, a very successful example in the US, whereas the Ministry of Defense is never held up as an example of innovative procurement in the UK, and I'd like to understand that better. But my particular question for you is this point about needing to keep the certain manufacturing skills local in order to support the process's innovation. But that may take time. I mean, those skills, they take a long-term investment, but it may take time as you transition from one technology to another. And I think your example of, of displays, it may take time during which manufacturing on a short-term basis locally may not be competitive. Now, is your argument that the policymakers, the government, has no role to play in supporting locally based innovation whilst it's not, locally based manufacturing whilst it's not competitive? Or how do we internalize the long-term dynamic benefits of having locally based manufacturing?
That's a great question. So I think there's a lot of what we would call path dependence in these evolutions, right? So countries that sometimes get an early start gain more advantage as time goes by because it becomes the place to go, right? So you think about it, young people who are graduating with a degree in that field say, well, I'm going to go there because that's where the jobs are, and then companies locate there. So I think one of the important roles of government can be to help tip some of those scales when you see it occurring. If you start to see some emerging commons, some kind of small investments can be pretty powerful. And I think there's a range of kind of investments, but I think the investments in the human resources can be the key one, and that's often the one that in today's economy is the bottleneck, right? So companies go to places where they can find the skilled workforce. If it's not there, you're never even going to get the ball rolling, and so that's where I think you can make the sector competitive more quickly. The other thing that has happened, and this came up, the discussion I was having earlier today in a seminar at 10 Downing around the role that DARPA has played in procurement. And in some sense, one of DARPA's roles has been to, where you have some of these emerging sectors, putting in a lot of R&D. In essence, what they're doing is they're subsidizing the sector, right? I mean, it is quite interventionist. And one of the things I just got out of the discussion this morning, because I was just coming at it completely from an American point of view, is I didn't see DARPA as that interventionist in the market. And one gentleman at the meeting just, and very articulately, explained that was very interventionist from a UK point of view. The kind of things DARPA does would be way out of bounds within the UK political kind of spectrum. And so I think some of these depend where you come at it. So DARPA, though, does play that role, helps kind of build some of that, capability. Now, this is becoming, by the way, though, for the Department of Defense in the US, a serious issue around sectors which are declining but are still needed for military purpose. And to the extent where there's been a lot of policy interest in my work, I get far more calls from the Department of Defense in the US than I get from the White House around the implications of this. Because there's some sectors where they're saying, we're not competitive, these are moving outside the US, and we're really worried about it. So, and there hasn't, so they're having discussions, should we be subsidizing some of these sectors to keep them afloat for national defense purposes, et cetera. And it's a tricky issue because politically it's complicated because, the best thing then, every company lobbies to say, we're critical for national defense, right? And it's becoming really complicated. I don't know the answer for those on the declining side.
A lady in the front row had her hand up initially.
Hey, Hutchison, Bell Media. Over the last few months, I've been working with the UK government's Technology Strategy Board and a wide range of media companies and digital industries on the Catapult Innovation Centre programme, which is basically bringing together university research and innovative companies to actually look at how we stimulate economic growth in the coming years. And I guess when I hear about manufacturing, and I think of all the companies that I've been working with over the months, I mean, you go into those companies now, and these are manufacturing companies of today. Digital Industries is really the manufacturing of today. And some of the things that I've come across, like medical imaging, it's exactly the same processes as video games imaging, and there are increasing crossovers amongst those sectors. And I guess I just wondered what your view was in terms of how important the digital technology is in being the core future manufacturing, which could be based all around the country and not just in the centre.
No, I mean, you raise an excellent point. There's a lot of things which from a statistical point of view are not considered part of manufacturing, right? So if you're running some of the, like a digital imaging center for diagnostics, et cetera, it's considered service economy, but in some sense it's a highly repetitive operation, et cetera. So I think those are fascinating and important technologies. So I'm certainly not against services. It's always about high value added. Where's the value add? Because again, how do you sustain wages in an advanced industrial economy facing intensifying global competition? It comes down to doing the stuff other people can't do. Some of it is manufacturing, some of it is services. And so there I would agree, I would agree with the critics of the manufacturing matters that we can't get obsessed and say it's only about manufacturing, but it's about these other kind of high value added complex services. And if I think about, you think about a server farm that a Google would operate or the kind of infrastructure an Amazon would operate. Statistically, is that services or manufacturing? I don't know. I don't care, right? I mean, it's complicated stuff, and running one of those takes a lot of skills and a lot of skilled workforce that looks a lot like advanced manufacturing in a lot of ways. So statistically, I don't know what it's irrelevant. It's real important stuff to be doing, and you want to be encouraging that.
We should probably take a couple of questions at once. There was a gentleman sat at the very back who had his hand. A gentleman sat.
Gotcha.
I'm Ian Wright. I'm Member of Parliament for Hartlepool, and I'm also Shadow Minister for Competitiveness and Enterprise. Really interested in what you were saying, particularly interested in skills. And basically, what do you think? I'd like to know your thoughts about the characteristics of an education system that help to facilitate innovation, flexibility, both from the very earliest stage, primary school, but also the big task of retraining the workforce.
Big issue.
In the light of a recession and the need to retrain. What are the characteristics of a good education system? And is the US and Europe good at it?
Well, I think there's a couple of things. There's certainly getting the basics right, which everybody talks about, the kind of, we call it the K through 12 education. that I think in the US we've been doing a lousy job at. We've been really struggling with that. You know, we have far too many people graduate high school who don't have reasonable reading skills, for example, which is shocking, and reasonable math skills. Those are the people I mentioned at the beginning. There are no jobs for them, and right? We can't. You know, as I said, 1.5 billion people entered the global workforce since 1990. That's a huge number. It used to be the U.S. workforce was about 155 million, and Europe's was about 100 in 1990, and Europe's was about, or U.S. was 125 million people in the workforce, and Europe was about 100, and Western Europe was about the same number. So roughly speaking, you competed, if you were European, you basically competed with other Europeans and Americans. And you think about the ratio was almost like 1 to 1, right? And you know, you kind of, and then you add, since 1990, 1.5 billion people to the workforce. This is not population, this is workforce. And you say, well, now, think about this. If you were a company, you're competitive, you know, from a competitive analysis point of view, you say, I've got a lot more competition. So a worker everywhere has huge competition. I don't care whether you're a frontline worker. You could be a software engineer in Silicon Valley. If you're a software engineer in Silicon Valley, California, make no mistake about it. You're competing with software engineers in Bangalore, right? They're competing for your job everywhere. So improving human capital at the end of the day is like the competitiveness policy that really, in some sense, the only one that really matters. So what do? Clearly, it makes having first-rate primary education, we use the term K through 12, absolutely essential. But then beyond that, there's a whole group of people. So there's folks who go on to kind of university training and making sure you're generating the kind of, I think a lot of, you know, the engineering graduates, et cetera, who drive this. Make sure you're training those people. Make sure there's enough of them at the university level. Again, in the US, what's fascinating, 67% of our PhDs in science and engineering are non-US residents. So we've done and now we've been fortunate that we've done a remarkably good job of keeping them in the US. So the stay rates are about 90%. We borrow, and I like to say, people talk about the US, we borrow a lot of financial capital from the rest of the world. We borrow far more human capital. And I'm much more worried about the human capital repatriating, because if we lose that, we're really in trouble. But then there's this middle ground of people who they complete primary education, but they're not going to go to a university. And I think that's an important group historically in the US. At least, I can only speak for the US situation. Right? I don't know the history well in the UK, but we had fairly strong kind of vocational education, technical skills training, et cetera. That has really evaporated. And that is concerning. So the refrain that I hear time and time again, and we're doing some statistical work now to get beyond the anecdote stage. So all I have are anecdotes. But as I've gone around the US talking to people who run manufacturing plants, I just keep hearing it over and over again. I would love to expand production. I can't find the skilled workforce I need. Now, in a country with 8.5% unemployment, there's something wrong there, right? Tool and die makers. I tell you, I've got a kid who's graduating college. It's like, become a tool and die maker. You're going to have a job, a well-paid job. All sorts of those kind of technical skills. Those are highly skilled jobs that do quite well. People aren't getting trained in those, and you just hear this over again. You go into manufacturing plants, the kind of people who have to operate very sophisticated equipment. They have to understand mathematics. They have to understand something about programming, et cetera. There's a need to get that kind of training. So it's not quite being a university graduate, but it's having that kind of. Now, whether that gets moved back into the high schools to just beef up what we're doing in the primary, or doing it at the community, we have what we call community college 2-year programs. There's a need. I see that as a big gaping hole in the U.S. labor force, where we're bifurcating between the high-end college graduate and the person with no skills. And that's just, I think, long-term. There's economic problems with that. I think there's big-time social problems you get into as well. You just wind up with a badly balanced economy.
If we take 2 questions, the gentleman at the back and gentleman at the front here.
Thanks. Imran Khan from the Campaign for Science and Engineering. I wanted to go back to your headline implication for companies that ultimately they want to what they want to do is co-locate their R&D with their manufacturing.
Yep.
And although the short-term impetus from the market is to move it abroad because it's cheaper, you think they're perhaps being short-sighted in doing that. And I really want to believe you. But I suppose I've got this voice in the back of my head saying, well, it surely is just much cheaper. And you look at the counterfactuals, companies like Apple, which do all their design and innovation in the States and outsource all the manufacturing abroad. Would you say to them, actually, you should be locating your manufacturing?
No, I would actually put them, sorry, I'll interrupt right there. I'd put them right smack. I'm going out to Apple in 2 weeks because they're very interested in my work. They're right smack in that quadrant, in that upper left-hand corner. It's completely modular. You don't have to. They spend a lot of time with their suppliers, make no mistake about it, but that's not the kind of stuff they need to co-locate.
Okay. Well, my kind of second half of that question was, in the case of the companies which are perhaps being short-sighted, given that this is a national issue for the UK or the US governments, what should the government then do? Because I think part of the reason that industrial policy or industrial strategy in the UK has got a bad name is because of instances where the government has gone in to try and save particular companies rather than work on particular industries. So what does government do in that case to try and encourage manufacturing to stay in the country?
Yeah, so I don't think government, look, companies are going to make mistakes, right? I mean, that happens. That's the way market economies work. So government can't keep trying to second guess what companies do. So if it sees a large company moving production, say, out of the UK, it can't say, well, that's a bad decision. We're going to stop you or we're going to try to subsidize you. You're going to have to let companies make their bad mistake because many companies will make the right decision. So that's, but I think one place it starts is by just making sure there aren't distortions which are leading them to overvalue moving out. In the US, we have one issue is around our tax code, the way it's set up and the way corporate taxes the way corporate profits get taxed. And if you generate profits outside the US, you don't pay tax on it until you repatriate. So there's been a lot of discussion around changing that. So now the tax system is, I barely understand the US and I don't know anything about it in the UK. So, but one place to start looking at is, gee, have we done something to actually create an unlevel playing field where, in fact, it just makes it a lot more valuable to move the manufacturing out? I think the other thing to look at is what is it that's driving some of those costs? Now, again, some of this government, some of this is just companies have to get the math right themselves. They have to do the analysis. They have to realize it's within their interest. And if companies get it wrong, you have to have a vibrant enough economy where others will get it right and take advantage of the resources which are being underutilized. There's not a lot government can do about what I'd call the mistakes that companies make. All it can do is make sure it hasn't created distortions which are really making it much more valuable for companies to go out. Or if there are countries which are providing big subsidies, right, to lure your manufacturers away, then I think you're in the realm of trade policy, right? In terms of if there's a product that's, they're being subsidized to move production outside the UK or the US, and that product is then being re-imported back in, I think there's legitimate trade issues there. Because that violates WTO policy, right? You should not just look at labor costs. Now, there's a whole series of other costs that have to be considered. I mean, the problem is companies historically just looked at labor costs. Now they're sophisticated. Most companies are sophisticated enough where they're looking at even logistics and other costs, but they don't look at the effect on their R&D capability over time. And they don't look at the effect of if we move out, what happens to the supplier base? And then if the supplier base disappears, what does that do for our ability to continue to innovate? It's hard analytically to do it. That's where it takes some judgment. But I've seen some companies who do it, and they're willing to sort of look at the numbers and kind of override what the short-term model says. So we certainly see examples of that.
Rod Dowler from the Industry Forum. How do you think these trends in manufacturing on demand locally, they're pioneering in MIT, are going to change this picture? Because you may not get the sort of mass assembly as you get now.
Right. So that's great. I mean, there is a lot of it certainly moves production closer to the market, so for a large economy like the US is certainly helpful because we're a large market. So it would mean putting more manufacturing closer. It'll certainly help large economies like China and India because then you want to be closer there as well. you know, again, your ability to do that, though, if you have an economy where, in essence, a lot of manufacturing skills have evaporated, then who's going to run these factories? Who's going to staff these factories? Where are the equipment vendors who are going to supply equipment for these factories? So that's where we're into this, again, the path dependence. If some of these capabilities erode, then lots of things around future manufacturing, it's like, well, the supplier base isn't there. The workforce base isn't there. Who's going to do all that stuff? So then that stuff becomes, you see it starting in other places first, and the productivity boom goes elsewhere. But those are very fascinating trends.
Gentleman in the front row had his hand up.
Sam Wheeler, BVCA. I'm like members of Parliament, another member of a northern industrial town, being a Mancunian. You mentioned the sociology aspect, and just to pick up on that, to what extent do you think there's a problem, both in the US and in the UK, that you have politicians who are still in love with River Rouge for all sorts of reasons, with that massive state-led sort of industrial vision. But simultaneously, you have a political class or liberal elite or whatever you want to call it, who, well, not many Harvard academics tell their children to become die makers. They tell them to become Harvard academics or lawyers or doctors or accountants. And therefore, you have a situation where the leaders in society are caught in a trap of how do they say, I want you to go off and learn how to weld metal together, but my children, of course, aren't going to do that.
That's a great question. I mean, there's a great issue there. So first, he made reference to River Rouge. For those who don't know, that was the large Henry Ford, when he built the first, one of the first big auto assembly plants in the US. It was completely vertically integrated from making the steel through assembling the cars. So that's the kind of one notion of the old manufacturing world. So you're saying there is this kind of almost nostalgic love for that kind of vision, and yet there's a social aspect of manufacturing is dirty work, and in fact, this occurs everywhere. I was recently at a company in Italy, a very high-end apparel maker, and I was talking to the CEO, and this is a very successful company. I was talking to the CEO, and I said, you know, I was asked sort of the same question, kind of what's your big problem, what's on your mind, what's keeping you awake at night? And now Italy has fairly high unemployment, struggling economy. He goes, I can't hire enough people for my factory. And he's in a region, now he's in Emilia-Romagna, which has got a 4% unemployment rate. Okay, so Emilia-Romagna is a pretty strong region. Because I just can't get people, right? And he said, it used to be, what we did is some years ago, we had Southern Italians coming up to be in the factories. But then when those people didn't want their kids to work in the factory. He goes, then we got immigrants to come in, and the immigrants worked in the factories. Because now what's happening is the immigrants don't want their kids to work. They want their kids to go to the university, which he said is a good thing. It's a natural kind of progression. But there's often people now winding up unemployed as well, right? So there is a kind of, manufacturing has gotten a bad name. It's gotten the name as sort of, you just rivet metal, the old idea of you know, kind of the Charlie Chaplin movie, modern times, where it's mindless. If you go into a lot of manufacturing plants, it's not mindless at all. And my argument would be the kind of manufacturing that has to thrive in the UK, the only kind that can thrive in the UK and the US, the only kind we should want to thrive is this part that requires high skills. Because the stuff that doesn't require high skills, that's going to the low-wage countries. And I think part of it is, you know, there is a social aspect of it in terms of how do you get people's mentality to change. Partly, and I don't have an answer to that. I mean, I don't have an answer to that. But I think as opportunities become available, if companies are investing in the skill sets, you know, and then ultimately, if labor markets are flexible, people will go where the jobs are, and if they have better opportunities. But you also have to make training available, and some companies, some manufacturing companies in the U.S. have now started to become much more proactive about giving talks in high schools, et cetera, about what a modern career in manufacturing looks like, just to get people's understanding a little different.
Alex, about that.
So thank you for a very interesting talk. I also work at Policy Exchange. One of the bits that sort of came into my head as you were talking towards the end was some of this could be thought of as the externalities of technology. Yeah. So you have you have a free marketeer who's generally in favour of the free market, who does accept there is I think there is a failure around technology, in that particularly things you can't patent, so abstract work, etc., etc. And that justifies, I think, a lot of the arguments that you're putting forward. So I wouldn't necessarily say it's a free market dichotomy versus old-fashioned. I'd say it's free marketing sort of with a bit of understanding. And that word externalities, that sort of concept, I think is a good way to package it.
Yeah. Clearly, I think the commons issue really does come down to externalities. As companies who are part of the commons, they benefit from the fact that others have been investing in their suppliers or training their workforce, et cetera. And there are externalities that are created that companies benefit off of. And therefore, even if you're a competitor is having troubles. In fact, actually, one of the issues that came up when General Motors was filing bankruptcy and Chrysler, if they were to liquidate, right, what would happen to the supplier base? And like, you normally think, well, if my two biggest competitors, say you're Ford, my two biggest competitors go out of business, well, that's better for me. Ford should have been popping champagne and celebrating. They were worried about the supplier base, because one company couldn't support the supplier base. So if the supplier base disappears and you're Ford, you got a big problem on your hand. So you're absolutely right. I think there's externalities here, and it's just a matter of kind of how those externalities are being valued, and different people on different parts of the debate, I think, are seeing them bigger or smaller.
A couple of gentlemen in the second row have had their hands up for a while, so if they can both ask.
Yeah, cheers. James Clark, BVCA as well. Quick one for you. You talk about geographic co-location. Are we talking about, what sort of proximity are we talking here? Are we talking sort of typical cluster theory? Are we talking within national borders because you get regulatory and tax issues? What are we talking about here?
That's a really great question. It is, I think it varies. It's generally, I think national borders, unless there's some regulatory issue, don't really matter. So a company, say, on one side of the Swiss border and the other on, say, the Italian side of the border, may not matter. So, for example, if anybody's familiar with, Zegna, the Italian clothing manufacturer, actually, one of their main factories is actually right over the border in Switzerland. I don't think it, but it's physically very close to where they're doing the design. I think it's kind of within the general bounds of what sort of cluster theory predicts in terms of, close enough where people can be interacting on a routine basis with kind of face-to-face. So in some cases, for small countries, that's going to cross boundaries. Certainly for a large a country like the United States, it may be a bigger problem. If your design is in, say, Austin, Texas, and you're manufacturing over the border in Mexico, that's probably less of a problem from what we're talking about here than if your design was in Massachusetts and you were manufacturing in California. So it's really the distance, because it's all about the face-to-face. And I think the relevant unit of analysis is the size of the labor market. So for me, it's ultimately often comes back to the labor market, because that's the common underlying pool. That's the common resource. Can we draw from the same labor market?
Hi, Alan Lockie, and I work in Parliament as well. You mentioned that, you keep mentioning that 1.4 people entered the global labour force in the 1990s. Yeah. And I wondered, do you ever foresee a time when sustaining a productive labour force at socially acceptable levels becomes becomes very, very difficult, precisely because of innovation and its capacity to, as we've seen in manufacturing, your first few slides, hollow out the labour force?
So this has been a debate, obviously, it's been going on for a long time, for a couple hundred years. And it was, and then most recently, a former colleague of mine at Harvard and a collaborator at MIT, Eric Brynolfsson, they have a wonderful book on IT and how basically IT is increasing productivity, and we're going to generate, the productivity growth will outstrip our ability to hire people, et cetera. But that presumes there's everybody has everything they already want. And my sense is there's still a huge amount of demand in the world. So I don't think, I can only speculate, but I don't think we're going to get to that point within the foreseeable time horizon. That is productivity improvements tend to generate more output per head, which increase, and wages and productivity growth, we know, are tightly correlated across countries, across industries. I mean, that's the best predictor of wage growth. We know, what do people do when they have higher wages? They buy more stuff. And part of the way productivity growth occurs is not through making stuff more inexpensively, but through inventing new stuff, right? So iPads. So suddenly we all discovered we needed iPads 2 years ago. I didn't know what one was, and now if I happen to leave for a business trip without one, it's like an emergency, right? So there's new stuff that comes along that will sort of demands our time productively. So I think we're in pretty good shape with productivity growth.
Two gentlemen in the fourth row there.
Ian Gleeson from McKinsey. It's a question about clusters. I mean, how important do you think the role of technology clusters is in sort of preserving or enhancing an economy's technology base? And secondly, what is the role of governments in creating those clusters, growing them, or should they be left to kind of grow organically around universities and technology institutes?
Yeah, so, cluster, I mean, we look at, the world still looks, so the first guy to sort of pose a cluster theory was Marshall, right, in Principles of Economics. And he laid out the theory of why we should see them, because he was wandering around England. He's looking at these little districts. Well, in Lancaster, they do this. And here we are 130 years later. And if you look at the data, we actually look very similar. And the world is still very clustered. I mean, there's life science clusters in sort of, Cambridge, Massachusetts, Cambridge, UK, and they also can be very specific, right? And we see with all sorts of industries tend to cluster. I think if you do and I think McKinsey's done some really nice studies of that. So we know they cluster. And one of the reasons, I mean, the key issue for me is we know that most labor mobility is local. So even in the United States, by the way, people rarely move out of state. A wonderful study done looking at inventor mobility, and it turns out that, and in the US we have a reputation for being very mobile. 3/4 of all inventors who have multiple patents, so these are particularly unusual people. You think they're the most mobile people. 3/4 never invent outside the same standard metropolitan area. We're remarkably immobile. And less than 1% of all moves in the US are outside a state in any given year. It's small. So clusters, I think, are important. Now, the interesting question is, what can a government do or not? I think government policies play a very big role in shaping those clusters. So if we say, why is there a big life sciences cluster in the Boston, Cambridge area? NIH spending combined with, Harvard, MIT, and 8 or 10 top academic medical centers, all of whom get huge amounts of funding for clinical research, goes a long way to explaining that. What can governments do to create clusters is a much trickier issue. Because once the dynamic has started in a place, then there's kind of perpetuating market forces that continue to drive it. And if you're not there, it's very hard to get started. So every state in the United States, all 50 states have groups, biotechnology industry associations. And they all have one goal. They all want to become either like Boston or San Diego, right? And so I had to go talk to these people about what they can do. And let's just say they're probably not going to have me back because my view was, look, I mean, once you've got Boston and San Diego, it's really hard if you're Nebraska. Wonderful state, nice place, but it's really hard to get started. Because you think about it, from a young scientist who graduates, finishes their postdoc, where are they going to go look for a job? Well, if I go to Boston, I go to work for a company, the company fails, and I've had friends who've been at companies that have failed, they haven't even had to change their parking space because there's 3 companies in the same suite. Where if I go to Nebraska or Cleveland, there's 2 biotechnology firms in Cleveland, and one of those companies fails, well, my job prospects are limited. I'm looking at relocating, and people don't like to relocate. So then the scientists go to that area. So if I'm going to start a company and I want to go for talent, where do I go? Well, I go to Boston, I go to San Diego, maybe Northern California, San Francisco. That's where I go. And so we could see one's a virtuous cycle and the other's in a vicious circle. Once you're at that stage, government policy I think is much harder to exert any kind of influence productively.
In danger of showing a bit of clustering in professional services, Charles Turvin, PwC. Just a question, I think following up on that, and actually on the rest of the conversation, is around that expectation management for some of these places where I fully agree on your point at kind of the macro level around productivity gains and the wider benefits and not the lump of labor fallacy. But how do you deal with the expectations for some of those places like Cleveland, which makes a lot of sense for refining petroleum in the late 19th century, and moving that on? And how do we try and deal with, particularly if we end up in a more automated high-tech manufacturing center that no longer needs the population within walking distance to be able to manage that?
Well, and the skill bases have to change, and it's traumatic. There are great success stories. If you look in the U.S., if you look at Pittsburgh, Pittsburgh was steel country, right? That was the headquarters of the whole, that was the American steel industry was based in Pittsburgh. And Pittsburgh went through lousy times starting in the 70s and the 80s. It was really in tough shape. Pittsburgh today doesn't have much steel, has no steel production, or certainly none that I can see. But it's become a center for biomedical research and financial services, very strong. And great universities there to help spawn at Carnegie Mellon, University of Pittsburgh. So I think the expectations are, look, you can recover if you're in one of these areas, but you can't sort of try to, again, it's sort of picking this thing is hard. To say, I want to be just like, I want to do this, that may not be what that part of the world is best suited to do. And that's where I think the danger of when you sort of pick winners and say, we're going to be in this sector, say, wait a minute, what sector we're in? I don't think anybody could have predicted Pittsburgh would have become a center of biomedical innovation 20 years ago. So a lot of these things are kind of hard to predict where they'll go. You have to make the investments to get the building blocks. You need mechanisms to allow so that labor can be mobile and reallocate. But I think it's very hard to pick the specific place. But you're right. I mean, I think there is often the wrong expectations.
Director Neil O'Brien had his hand up.
Neil O'Brien from Policy Exchange. One of the things that we've been thinking about here is about kind of city size and clusters. And one policy tool the government does have is it's moving public sector jobs, particularly good public sector jobs around the country. Big discussion about the BBC moving Salford at the moment. It strikes me, one of my former colleagues used to work for an economic regulator based in Birmingham, but he would commute there every day from London because, of course, his wife couldn't find a job in Birmingham. She's also highly skilled. You know, we've got, what do we call it, associative mating these days. So should government actually be trying to pick winning cities? Should we be putting all these things in a couple of large labour markets rather than, as we do at present, scattering them around the country?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't know. I think if obviously, if you sort of do a little bit here and a little bit there, you probably end up having no impact, right? The danger, of course, is you pick, I think you've got, certainly people who are involved with politics probably have a much better read on this. I think the politics of doing that are challenging because if you say we're going to do it all in this particular place and not here, it's, you know, one set of people get the votes and the other set of people don't. I mean, it's probably very challenging to do that. We do this a bit in the US, by the way, and it leads to inefficiency with a lot of spending, like for government labs. That almost always gets spread around. And you know, the working rule of thumb is, you know, there's 2 senators from each state. You need, you know, you just do the math, how many states you need to spread it around. And that often leads to inefficiency, it's subscale, and rigidity. So I've done some work with NASA on restructuring how they're doing R&D to do a much more decentralized kind of open innovation model. You know, and one of the challenges you have is there's certain NASA labs that are in certain states because they've been spread around strategically. So the politics are tricky. I think the economics are such where kind of focal investments, but you know, may be more efficient to do, may be more efficient. If you don't go overboard, you don't want to throw it all into one place, obviously, but it's probably more efficient to concentrate it a bit.
Just got one eye on the time. I think we've got time for 2 more questions, and the chap at the front has had his hand up for a while, and also the gentleman standing up at the back.
Hi, Albert Bravo from Nesta. I just wanted to follow up on the commons idea. and the externalities idea. You've mentioned some people put them in. If you're in a policy debate, there is debates about based on intuitions, and there are debates based on evidence and data. And with the commons debate and the externalities debate, at the end, the debate depends on how big is the fact. So how do we actually put data and evidence? I haven't read the book, so maybe the answer is all there. But how do we put data and evidence in terms of measuring the value of externalities, of collocation, of commons? To define what policy should we be doing?
So it's a great question. So there's a couple of things you can do, and we've done it. Is, first of all, you just sort of document. First of all, you do the best you can to sort of document what the impact of these have been to get some size. But if you're saying measuring the size, if you want to measure, I think it really depends what you're trying to achieve with the measurement of the size of the effect. I think it's just going to vary by sector too. But certainly you can look at flows of labor across sectors to pick up some idea. You can look at what happens when certain kind of plants close or relocate, what happens to kind of lost output in other sectors. So it's all very measurable. We have all the statistics to measure it, and you can do it. And we kind of, we do some of that in the book to sort of tease it out. Mostly at this stage around particular cases, trying to understand what happened in one industry and how it's just really establishing at this phase proof of concept, if you will. And then once we understand the concept, then we can be a little better at measuring the effects. But I guess you'd have to ask why you're measuring it too. What is you want to?
Professor Pisano, I'm a product of having lived through pretty well most of what you've been talking about here. I started as an engineering apprentice at Longbridge when there were 25,000 employees, and it was a city of its own, as Ford was in Dagenham with 50,000 people. Now Longbridge is a desert almost, that everything's disappeared, and it pulls at your heartstrings. But it was a big integrated manufacturing operation. The point I want to make with you, or ask you, you've talked about apprenticeships and engineering apprenticeships, and that generation that now want their kids to grow up and go to university and have a higher calling, such as perhaps working in the city, if that is a higher calling, which it may be or it may not be. But the problem seems to me that you run out of a labour force if there's no long-established apprenticeship structure anywhere. And I think I'd like to ask your view on that, because it seems to be a big problem.
No, I would agree with that. You get into the vicious circle, where I've certainly seen cases where companies have said that it's, we can't hire in particular areas because we don't have the labor force. We can't find the labor force, so we're going to move production, which then makes the supply problem worse. Because one thing we know, and we're actually doing some work now, I'm collaborating with a labor economist on this, I shouldn't say we know it, we strongly suspect it, is university graduates, the kids graduating from college are very good at looking into the future and understanding where jobs are going to be. So if they're getting an inkling that a sector is going to decline, they just get out of that. So I would just, for example, in the UK, I wonder if you compared the number of, say, production engineering graduates in the 60s with the number of production engineering graduates today. I've never done it, but my guess would be much lower today. That is, kids today look out and say, I don't see the jobs for me as a production engineer, so I pull out of it. Then if you go to a company and say, hey, why don't you do more of your sophisticated production in the UK, I bet you there'll be some companies that say, I can't find the production engineers, right? It's the kind of chicken and egg problem. And so this is where it's, again, the role of government in terms of investing in creating the right kinds of human capital, make sure the supply side of the market is there. Because without the supply side, you're not going to get the demand side, right? It's very hard to generate that. And so, this means having the right kind of, Germany's been a country that's done a great job in sort of investing in workforce skills at an appropriate level through sort of the apprenticeship programs and other things. In the US, we haven't, and we're going the opposite way. We've been scaling dramatically back on our community college programs, which are the ones that teach a lot of those kind of, again, middle sort of skills basis. That could be a very short-sighted investment decision on our part.
Very sorry to say that we're out of time. Thank you to Gary for.
Well, thank you. No, thank you all for coming.